Welcome to the programme. Australia's immigration minister has cancelled Novak Djokovic's visa for a second time, just 3 days before the world #1 player is due to play in the Australian Open in Melbourne. Well, the Australian government says it is on public health grounds as the row over his right to remain in the country unvaccinated continues. His lawyers have appealed against the decision and a hearing is now set for Sunday morning, local time, in the federal court. Our correspondent Phil Mercer has the latest from Melbourne.
This all began over a week ago when Novak Djokovic landed at Melbourne's International Airport. He was stopped by Border Force officials. Eventually, they told him because he'd not adhered to immigration rules surrounding a medical waiver for a COVID-19 vaccination, his visa was cancelled. He was placed into immigration detention on Monday. That decision was overturned by a federal court judge here in Melbourne. The Australian Immigration Minister Alex Hawke said straight away that he would therefore be reviewing the judge's decision because the Immigration Minister has these personal executive powers to, again, cancel a visa. That was on Monday. Today, of course, is Friday. And now the Immigration Minister, after quite a long gap, has made the decision to again revoke Novak Djokovic's visa. It's not the end of the story. We understand that Novak Djokovic's lawyers are putting together a comprehensive argument against deportation. They say, for example, that he poses a negligible risk to public health, that he's got a genuine reason for that medical exemption and is of good standing. So once again, we go from the tennis courts here at Melbourne Park into the legal courts of Melbourne to decide the fate of the world #1 tennis player.
Phil Mercer there. Well, all eyes on Melbourne. What is the reaction to all this in Serbia? Our correspondent Guy Delorney sent this update from the capital, Belgrade.
Well, you can imagine the reaction in Serbia to the latest developments down in Australia. The media were absolutely outraged. One of the tabloid newspapers was running a poll on its website saying, "What do you think of the deplorable action of Australia?" Talk about a leading question, and you could vote with either a smiley face or a very frowny and angry face, and you won't be surprised to hear that the frowny and angry faces constitute about 95% or so of the votes cast so far. In terms of official reaction, I think the ministers at the moment here are keeping their powder dry. They're waiting to see how the hearings go in Melbourne before they come out and say anything. But I would say that all the way down the line, the government have been saying to us that there's a limit to what they can do. They're trying to represent Novak Djokovic, they're trying to back him up, but they know also that they can't interfere with a judicial or a ministerial process in Australia, so their influence is limited. In terms of the tennis world in Serbia, people are reacting very strongly to this. I spoke to Viktor Troicki, who's the coach of the Davis Cup team for Serbia and a very close friend of Novak Djokovic, and he said he was shocked by the decision in Australia. Not just that, but he was concerned that the ATP, the Men's Tennis Association, hadn't been giving enough backing to the man who is the world #1.
Well, I am joined now by Alexander Downer, former Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Do you think the Australian government is acting in the right way here?
Yes, I mean, they're just acting according to law. So the basic proposition is that you can go to Australia if you have been vaccinated. If you haven't been vaccinated, you have to serve 2 weeks in quarantine, in a quarantine hotel. So that is the basic, that's...
Have we still got you?
Yes, I'm still here.
Sorry, it just froze for a second. Sorry, we caught the first half. Do carry on.
In the case of Novak Djokovic, he wanted to be exempted from the 2 weeks quarantine, despite the fact that he hasn't been vaccinated. There isn't any provision for that exemption, and he tried to claim that he'd had COVID, and therefore, on the basis that he'd had COVID, he should be exempted. But the federal government's explained that such an exemption doesn't exist in Australian law. So, I mean, he's made a lot of mistakes on the way through here, including falsely filling in his his immigration form. So I'm not surprised at what's happened, really.
But is your understanding that the grounds that have been given so far to the courts in terms of the Immigration Minister Alexander Hawke exercising his power to cancel the visa on health and public good order grounds, is that's completely legally correct, is it?
Yes,
Is there any way that it can be challenged as you see it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds as though Djokovic's lawyers will challenge it, and he will challenge the decision. But on the other hand, that is the basis on which the federal government stipulates, and has for quite some time stipulated, that it doesn't want unvaccinated people coming into Australia who don't serve time in quarantine, because that increases the risk of the spread of COVID. I mean, that is the simple point. Whether he himself would spread COVID, well, that's debatable, of course, in his particular case. But on what basis could the federal government make an exemption for someone who's a famous tennis player and not apply the same rules to people who want to be in Australia to be with a dying parent or whatever? I mean, you can't run a country like that.
What about any apparent errors by the authorities, all the different authorities in Australia? Because it is still puzzling as to why he was given a visa in the first place, why all the tennis bodies and the state and the federal machinery was not more joined up.
That just reflects the fact that people outside of Australia understandably don't really understand how Australia works. Tennis Australia is just a tennis association. It's not an official organisation that determines whether...
But he was allowed initially to get on a plane, though, wasn't he? Which suggests that some of his documentation must have been in order up to a point.
Yeah, but it wasn't all in order. And he himself has admitted that he had falsified part of his form filling, and that, of course, has been subsequently decided. Look, the important point to remember here is the federal government is the body that decides who comes into the country and who doesn't, not the Victorian state government, and certainly not a tennis association. So insofar as people are arguing the tennis association gave him the green light, the tennis association doesn't make the decision. The federal government makes these decisions. They're not contracted out to a tennis association.
And does he really need to be detained? I mean, is that, again, part of this legal process, or is it sort of designed to humiliate him and, give a great big public health message? Look, do not come into our country unless you're fully jabbed.
He is subject to exactly the same rules as anybody else. No special privileges, and he's certainly not being persecuted because of who he is. But, there's no point in him trying to argue that because he's the world's #1 tennis player, there should be special privileges for him. The Australian public would just not tolerate that. I mean, they expect him to be treated like anyone else. And so in terms of his treatment, he was detained by Border Force when he arrived because he hadn't met the vaccination requirements. The court decided that the Border Force officials who detained him hadn't given him due process before he was detained, so that's been undone by the court. But, now he will have to leave the country unless he can find some legal loophole that will get him out. But certainly
that would be very embarrassing, wouldn't it, for the government? And, Djokovic's legal team is saying that cancelling this visa is patently irrational. What do you think of that?
That's his side of the story, and I don't agree with you, by the way. I don't think it is embarrassing for the Australian government. I think it would be embarrassing if the Australian government decided to give a special privilege that other, particularly Australian citizens, are not entitled to the world's #1 tennis player. I think that would be embarrassing, but otherwise, no. I mean, the Australian government is just applying its rules, and it's as simple as that. No special privileges for anybody.
Alexander Downer, this story has gripped many people right around the world. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.